India is now 4 weeks into the biggest electoral process on the planet. Narendra Modi is everywhere, on every channel, all over social media, and his language is deeply divisive. The ICC, the charges against Israel and Hamas, and the coverage that tells its own story. And have you read the headlines on Gaza? There, fixed it for you. The election now underway in India is happening on a scale that no other country can match, with more than 950 million eligible voters casting ballots over 6 weeks, and the various parties spending a reported $15 billion on their campaigns. The betting favorite is Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Hindu nationalist party, the BJP, gunning for an historic third term. India also has a media space like no other, featuring more than 400 news channels, the vast majority of which do Modi's bidding 24/7. And they've stepped it up a notch, conducting an unprecedented number of interviews with the Prime Minister, lobbing softball questions his way, fawning in front of the cameras. And yet, even with all of those factors playing in the BJP's favor, Modi and the party's other star campaigners have leaned heavily into what they consider their primary election-winning strategy, bashing Indian Muslims, calling them infiltrators, out to eat up national resources. It is dangerous language, and it's being repeated over and over because despite all of those interviews, no one is really holding the Prime Minister to account. It is fitting that the world's largest democracy, India, has the longest election process of them all. Over the first 4 weeks of voting, and with about a week to go, an unexpectedly low turnout suggests that for Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP, things are not going according to plan. One sure sign of that, the Prime Minister, who has spent 10 years in office, mostly avoiding interviews with the mainstream media, is spending more time with journalists than ever before.
Prime Minister Modi rarely gives interviews. He does not hold press conferences. However, from the 31st of March to the 14th of May, he gave 41 interviews, which is quite the blitz. What these interviews do is make him front and center on television channels, in newspapers, to remind people of his charisma and his appeal.
The BJP knows that Mr. Modi is its best trump card when it comes to elections. The BJP does better when it comes to national elections as compared to the state elections. The reason being that in national elections, Mr. Modi is the face that they're projecting. So you maximize the visibility of your best performer.
Can I be very blunt? These interviews are nothing but sort of unpaid political advertising, designed to project the Prime Minister to a wide audience.
Sir, आप भारत के तो सबसे लोकप्रिय नेता हैं ही, अब दुनिया के भी सबसे लोकप्रिय नेता हैं, और शीर्ष पर बने रहना का अपना एक दबाव भी होता है बहुत. आप कभी उस दबाव को महसूस करते हैं?
The questions are not searching, they're not challenging. They don't deal with obvious problems that have come up in Mr. Modi's 10-year record. There are no follow-up questions.
Best friend है नरेंद्र मोदी का कोई best friend है BFF, best friend forever.
Indian journalists could argue that they're just out of practice. After a decade of struggling to get access to the Prime Minister, their now frequent exchanges with him, while presented as spontaneous and unscripted, appear to have been anything but.
ये sense of pride जो आपने भारतीयों में और हिंदुओं में भरा है, क्या ये आपकी सोच थी कि मुझे ऐसा करना है?
The vast majority of Indian news outlets, including almost all of the 400 24/7 news channels, are explicitly pro-Modi, for reasons ranging from the ideological to the pragmatic. In such a crowded media space, most outlets have come to depend on revenue from government advertising, which the BJP controls. Media owners often own diversified conglomerates. Their other companies do business with BJP governments in New Delhi and in various states, so it is in their interest to be in the party's good books. And too many news organizations to mention that have been critical of Modi have landed in legal trouble with the government, including the tax authorities. The selection of outlets and interviewers Modi chooses to talk to, therefore, can be as revealing as the questions those interviewers do or do not ask.
बहुत इमोशनल आदमी है लेकिन उसे दुनिया से छुपाता है।
ऐसा है कि अब टीवी का जमाना है तो लोगों को पता चल जाता है।
Some of the names that come to mind are Rubika Liaquat from TV18, Navika Kumar from Times Now, Arnab Goswami from Republic, Rahul Kanwal and others from India Today, and other outlets such as ANI, PTI, Aaj Tak, ABP News that were granted interviews. There were some national dailies as well, Hindustan Times and Times of India, and a couple of significant regional media outlets. None of these interviews have been granted to anyone who's known to be a vocal critic of the government or Prime Minister Modi.
I wouldn't ask the Prime Minister about his daily routine and what time he wakes up and what he eats for breakfast or how he maintains his energy through the day. Serious journalists should be asking about the problems of unemployment, the problems of jobless growth, price rise and inflation, the fact that there are people in his party that continually play divisive, polarizing politics on the ground, people who have been convicted of acts of terrorism, who remain members of his party and what he thinks about that. These are questions to ask the Prime Minister of the country, right? A record of his term. The rest is fluff.
The ground rules are pretty clearly established because it cannot be that you don't have follow-up questions.
आपके कटाक्ष और आपके one-liners याद रहेंगे.
The fact is that today there is not a single channel that is willing to buck the trend. All of these outlets, in English, Hindi, or in different regional languages, are so beholden to the government and so much in awe of Mr. Modi that you didn't have any kind of serious questioning at all.
There have been rare exceptions. Amidst all of the softballs, a few hard-hitting questions, most notably about the unmistakable turn taken by Modi and the BJP in their election messaging to explicit Muslim bashing.
स्टेज पर आपने मुसलमानों का जब जिक्र किया तो घुसपैठिया, ज्यादा बच्चा पैदा करने वाला, इसकी क्या जरूरत आनी पड़ी थी?
मैं हैरान हूँ जी कि किसने आपको कहा कि जब ज्यादा बच्चों की बात होती है तो सिर्फ मुसलमान का नाम जोड़ देते हैं.
ये संपत्ति इकट्ठी करके किसको बांटेंगे? जिनके ज्यादा बच्चे हैं उनको बांटेंगे.
The interviewer could have reminded Modi of some of his other campaign speeches containing coded, derogatory language like that has been long used to describe Indian Muslims, but she let him off the hook. Nor has Modi been asked to answer for some of the ugly campaign ads his party has put out, like this one, a cartoon depiction of Rahul Gandhi, the leader of the biggest opposition party, the Congress, feeding Muslims to the point where they outgrow other minority groups in India and rule the roost.
He's been making claims that the Congress wants to seize private wealth and redistribute it among Muslims. And he has been citing these claims to the Congress's election manifesto. Now, if you look at the Congress's election manifesto, these two claims do not feature in that document. But whenever Modi speaks at an election rally or he speaks in an interview, these are broad themes that he's been focusing on.
क्या आपकी मेहनत की कमाई का पैसा घुसपैठियों को दिया जाएगा?
This has sort of become the major plank of the BJP's campaign.
Prime Minister Modi himself, his own political campaign, has gone back to old tropes of the Hindu right, where they are trying to sort of create a polarizing image of the opposition as a group of ragtag coalition parties that's going to eliminate or going to sideline the majority Hindus. So that's been a very clear shift in message of the BJP from the beginning of the election. The fact that he's gone back to the old sort of tropes of Hindutva politics signifies the need for the BJP to ensure that the base is not in a state of disarray.
In the 10 years under Narendra Modi's rule, According to the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, India has sunk from 140th to 159th out of the 180 countries on that list. With that track record, it takes a special kind of gall to say, as Modi did last week, that his prior reluctance to give interviews and his continued refusal to hold even a single press conference is because of a, quote, lack of neutrality in the Indian media. There is such a lack, but it works in Modi's favor, not against it. To suggest otherwise does not inform Indian voters. It leaves them misinformed.
The agenda of the media is to ask difficult questions of those who are in power. And the whole purpose of living in a democracy is that leaders present themselves for questioning and are not afraid to answer questions, because that's the way journalism is. What the world considers news on TV, you do not have that in India today. You have propaganda outlets. Things will get much worse, obviously, if Mr. Modi comes back to power.
I barely watch television news in India anymore myself. I can't bear to watch it. Everyone's screaming at each other all the time. It's sunk pretty much to the bottom. What would happen in another term? Just more of the same. And as long as there's an audience, they'll keep delivering. That's the sad truth, right? There's a reason why Indian news television was under state control till the early 90s. Because it was a very powerful tool of communication, propaganda, whatever. Today, you don't need to be government-owned to be part of the propaganda machine. You just are. And the bigger your business is, the more reliant you are on the government for money, and therefore the more willing you are to do the government's bidding, whoever the government of the day may be.
This past week, the International Criminal Court announced its intention to seek arrest warrants for leaders in both Israel and of Hamas. The reaction from Tel Aviv and Washington has been fast and furious. Tariq Nafi has been following how it all unfolded.
Well, this was an historic decision by ICC prosecutor Karim Khan. The first time the court has targeted a sitting Western-backed leader, in this case Benjamin Netanyahu, for war crimes and crimes against humanity. There was some unusual choreography in the way the announcement was made. Khan went public before the arrest warrants were approved, which may be a sign of the pressure he is under. He put out not just an official statement on social media, but also this pre-recorded interview with CNN.
We're not going to be swayed by the different types of threats, some of which are public and some maybe are not. This court is built for Africa and for thugs like Putin, was what one senior leader told me.
The ICC prosecutor was talking about the intimidation he and his office have come under in recent weeks, but he also revealed how Western leaders view the court and the kinds of leaders it should pursue. While the ICC has had an open investigation into the situation in Palestine for more than 2 years, Khan chose to narrow his focus to war crimes committed since October 7th, which has done little to mollify Israel and its allies.
Mr. Khan takes his place among the great anti-Semites in modern times.
Labeling critics anti-Semites is hardly new material for Israel's Prime Minister. He then followed up with a series of interviews with US networks, which included this barely concealed threat he delivered on ABC.
I'm not concerned at all about our status. I think that the prosecutor should be concerned about his status.
Reactions in the US have been similar. President Joe Biden called the ICC's decision outrageous. Many observers have pointed out the US government's hypocrisy in protecting Israel's impunity, given how enthusiastically it greeted the arrest warrants issued for Vladimir Putin. And while the media and political debate rages on about the ICC decision, Israel continues to massacre, maim, and starve Palestinians in Gaza, including in Rafah, which President Biden once said was a red line.
Thanks, Tariq. In 8 months of the war on Gaza, media coverage, especially from outlets in the United States, has been torn apart by critics. The repeated inaccuracies, the regurgitation of Israeli talking points, the striking absence of context. Such failings can jump out at you because often they're in the headlines. Copywriters commit all kinds of journalistic sins and sometimes try to justify them by saying that headlines need to be brief. But the result can be incomplete, misleading text that is quite often at odds with the reporting that follows. And since many readers never get past the headlines, the misinformation contained there can have an effect on public opinion. One historian, Assal Rad, has been on a journalistic mission to fix those headlines. She's been tweeting them out with strike-throughs, annotations, and critiques. Her work has gone viral because it's so on point. We spoke with Assal Rad about how an American academic has found herself patrolling a small but significant corner of the Fourth Estate, the world of headlines.
My name is Assal Rad, and I am a historian of the modern Middle East. And since the beginning of this war, and actually before this war, I have been correcting headlines. As a historian, I know how important narrative and storytelling is. And the way that this story is being told, in the Western media especially, is not right, and it's not accurate. So I tend to focus on headlines because the reality is most people don't read beyond them. Often news content is paywalled, or people just don't have that much time within their day to dedicate to every topic. Headlines do catch the eye though, and they shape the way that people think about these issues. The framing of stories on Palestine and Israel in the Western world, and particularly the US, has always been very one-sided. These headlines and stories, the way they're written, the use of language, it's all deliberate and all intentional. And I wanted people to see how a simple change of words could improve the way these stories are framed and the journalism behind it. One pattern I see so often is headlines that whitewash Israel's culpability in war crimes by not even mentioning the word Israel. An original headline from the New York Times reads, "Strikes pound Rafah, flatten large mosque." And this is an older headline. This is before the recent attacks we're seeing in Rafah now. There's so many issues with this one. But let's start with the most glaring. Which force is behind the strikes? It's Israel, right? So why is that not mentioned? It's an omission, and that omission is not accidental because you see a pattern of it happening. Then strikes. You could have added 3 letters and made it very clear that they were in fact airstrikes. There's a mention of Rafah, but no reference to the fact that it's in Gaza, that Gaza is a part of the Palestinian territories, and this might confuse people who aren't knowledgeable about the entirety of the geography. But also the fact that Rafah is the last refuge for Palestinians in the Strip is so important. I mean, that's the reason why Rafah is in the news and in the headline in the first place. You know, there might be a counter-argument that says, well, all of those details are what the entire article is for. The headline doesn't have to give all of that away. But you see that the addition of just a few words makes it very easy to bring the context into the headline. And then you can explain the details in the body of the piece. But this headline in its original form is so problematic because it attributes basically nothing to no one. You're not clear where this is taking place, you don't know what exactly happened, and you have no clue who did it.
Thursday's attack has been described as a massacre of civilians. Hundreds of starving Palestinians had gathered to collect food aid when they were attacked.
So this headline was published after the Flower Massacre, which happened in February of this year, where we saw really horrifying footage of Palestinians killed while trying to get food. The headline reads, "In chaotic scene, many are killed and wounded as Israelis open fire," which is just an absurd way of phrasing what happened. So one of the first problems with this phrasing is it makes it seem like chaos is inherent to the situation because it's Gaza, not because of the external forces, specifically the Israeli forces, that are causing the situation. Also, it wasn't a chaotic scene, it was a massacre. And to call it a chaotic scene is just an obscene way of talking about it. The headline also says, "Many are killed and wounded." They've used passive voice to describe a situation in which more than 100 starving people who are being deliberately starved, were killed. Israeli forces opened fire on them as they were trying to get food from the aid convoys. That's what happened. When you look at reporting from other conflicts, like Russia's war against Ukraine, you see the difference in language used very quickly. In this headline, how Russia is using Ukrainians' hunger as a weapon of war. You can see very clearly there's no passive voice. Russia is named as the responsible party, and the crime that is being committed by Russia is stated clearly in plain English. Also, Ukrainians are named as the victims. If you notice, I underlined that line, residents of Mariupol, Ukraine, because that's not how Palestinians in Gaza are talked about. Writers use Gazans rather than Palestinians. So Ukrainians in a specific location in Ukraine are still called Ukrainians, but in the case of Gaza, too often there are no references to Palestinians. And this goes back to the idea of how, not just in the media, but also in our political discourse, Palestine is fragmented. People might not understand that Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, they're all part of a Palestinian state. They're all Palestinian territories. And if you single out Gazans without explaining that they're Palestinians, you're essentially separating Gaza from the larger issue of Palestinian statehood and liberation. And this falls into an Israeli pattern of erasing Palestinian identity and Palestinian statehood by treating each of these illegally occupied territories and their people as separate entities. People in Gaza are Palestinians, and journalists should call them that. I share a lot of headlines from The Onion. It's a satirical news site in the US, and their headlines are supposed to be a joke. They're supposed to be humorous exaggerations that sort of put a mirror up to society and politics, and especially the way that our own media covers events. But some of The Onion's older posts on this particular issue, on Israel-Palestine, and the US's role in it, they almost read like predictions. We've come to the point where the situation with Gaza has become so atrocious that The Onion's headlines have become pretty spot on. This headline reads, Netanyahu assures critics he still has the utmost respect for US money. And the context in which I shared it was that Netanyahu had canceled a visit by an Israeli delegation to Washington, D.C. because the US finally didn't veto a ceasefire resolution at the United Nations. They did everything, and this was back in March of this year. They did everything to undermine the resolution still by calling it non-binding, but they didn't actually veto it. But Netanyahu wasn't so upset that he turned down the $3.3 billion in taxpayer dollars that the US is giving Israel to fund its wars. He was very quick, in fact, to thank America for that money. Mind you, this Onion headline is from originally 2015, when the Obama administration was at odds with the Netanyahu government. But despite those very clear disagreements, Obama still handed Israel a $38 billion package of military aid over 10 years that was the largest of its kind. Years later, the Onion's headline is still applicable because Netanyahu is still in power. He's still snubbing the US and undermining US policy and international law, and he's still getting billions of dollars, which he's happy to get. When you talk about a mask-off moment, Gaza has really shredded anything that resembles the sort of world order that we had become accustomed to hearing Western powers, especially the United States and mainstream media in the US, champion for such a long time. And they're still using that language, but with such an egregious level of hypocrisy that everyone can see it now. And I think that's the part that's resonating with so many people with these headline corrections. The state of Israel seems to be able to get away with anything, and not be held accountable. And the fact that the media is so complicit in this process, that it continues to whitewash Israel's crimes and parrot basically whatever the US's official line is, it's a real abdication of its role. And these incomplete, inaccurate headlines are shaping how people think, and that's why I think it's so important to point it out.
And finally, the ongoing case against Julian Assange may well have taken a major turn this past week. The Biden administration is pursuing Assange for WikiLeaks' publishing of classified documents exposing American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. This week, British judges granted Assange the right to appeal against extradition to the U.S. to make the case that he would not get a fair trial there. The judges zeroed in on Washington's failure to promise that if extradited, Assange, an Australian citizen, would be entitled to the same constitutional protection that Americans get under their First Amendment, which safeguards freedom of speech. Supporters of Assange say that this ruling provides more than just a glimmer of hope. It is a potential turning of the tide, that after 5 years in a maximum security prison in London, Julian Assange could be a free man in a matter of months. And in a case that has implications for journalists around the world, that's big news. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.